it's a reflection of what Deuteronomy says, that parents are the primary educators because parents are the ones that children do life with.
Erin, you've got some big news to announce. I mean, this is big news. Let's share this with our listeners.
That is so, what's ridiculous is anytime that is said to a woman, it's assumed like, oh,
what?
Big news. She's pregnant. Isn't that what
that's
whatever.
What people
you
assume?
are totally trying to do that.
No.
Now I'm a grandmother, so that would be quite a big announcement if I was pregnant, but.
Well, that's true. That's true. Grandma gives birth to twins or something like that.
It's happened before.
Well, in a sense, we're going to be giving birth in February.
No.
That's not a good lead in?
No. Putting on a conference is nothing like giving birth.
Well,
so
no, you just gave away the announcement.
I'm offended by the analogy.
I was trying to build anticipation, excitement, big announcement.
It's a big announcement, but it has no similarities to giving birth. And I could attest to that.
Now, okay. Well, I can't.
So I'll
take your word for it.
Yeah. You will just have to take my word for it. So, big announcement is...
The Maven Conference is coming. And we will be giving birth to the Maven Conference February 24th and 25th.
No.
Start that announcement again. Let's go. Okay. So we, Maven, we hold an annual conference in Southern California the last weekend in February. And so that's happening in, about a month and a half. And this is a conference that we put a ton of work into to serve you, to serve parents, to serve educators, to serve grandparents, to serve school teachers, youth workers, everyone who's got a stake in the lives of the next generation. And this conference is intentionally geared to you to help equip you so that you are in a place where you feel like you can equip young people, children and students to navigate all of the challenges that are thrown their way. And so I want to encourage you, if you have been to a Maven conference, of course, you've already seen it for yourself. There's tremendous feedback from those who come year in and year out. But if you've never been to a Maven conference, I would encourage you to make that investment, because it's really an investment in you and your family and in the kids that you're working with. So this year's theme is restoration, right? A lot of times we talk about critiquing culture and looking out for all the bad stuff that's out there. And frankly, a lot of parents know for Christians, there's a lot of challenges out there. But sometimes we can overemphasize the bad stuff. And this year we want to balance that out by saying, hey, okay, what are the things that we're for? Let's articulate those as well. Let's critique culture. Let's critique the bad ideas and false ideas out there. But then let's also remember that God's kingdom is at hand, and he's doing a work of restoration. He started that. And so we'll be looking at things like God's restoration for the value of human life, the design of family, sexuality, God's restoration of the mission of the church, those kind of things. And so great lineup of speakers, of course. Mrs. Erin Kunkel will be there. Scott Klusendorf, Christopher Yuan, Cindy Rollins. Very excited about Cindy. Myself, Jonathan Morrow, Monique Desan. And so it's a great lineup. Go to mavenconferences.com. You can find all the information there, and you can register there as well. And if you live out of state, we want to encourage you, hey, there are people every single year that come from out of state for the Maven Conference. And look, I mean, it's sunny Southern California in February. And like, if you live in Buffalo or Minnesota, right? Or anywhere else in the nation, you don't want to be there. You don't want to be at that spot at the end of February. So you want to come to Southern California. So that's another huge selling point. So go to mavenconferences.com. And hey, also just want to encourage you, if you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, this podcast, first question is, hey, why do you hate happiness?
Oh my God.
And then secondly, want to encourage you, get on, subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of these exhilarating episodes. And also so to inflate our numbers to look like we have a huge platform. Okay.
That's a core value of ours.
Yeah. Important. Those are important announcements. Want
yeah.
to get those out of the way first before we get into the topic of today's podcast, which
actually you mentioned Cindy Rollins, and she is going to be at the Maven conference, and she is going to do our pre-conference event Thursday night, and then we'll be speaking at the conference as well. But one of the roles that Cindy is going to play at the Maven conference is talking about education. And so today's podcast, we get a lot of questions, you and I, Brett, and in our personal lives. And then Maven gets a lot of questions because people know that we homeschool our kids. And so we'll get a lot of questions about homeschooling. Why did we homeschool? How did you figure out how to do it? All kinds of questions. So today you thought it would be a good idea if we invited people into our homeschool cult and initiate. No, that's sometimes the perception that is out there, that, by turning to homeschooling, you join this kind of alternate world.
And that used to be more pervasive, but as more people homeschool, you're getting less of that.
Yeah. And I do think statistically more people are homeschooling. Of course, COVID was a time where all the schools in the world were shut down. And so people were doing school from home with their kids. And so that provoked lots of thoughts, emotions, feelings, and parents rethinking what they were doing for education, which I think in a lot of ways that was a really good thing for parents to start thinking about it maybe in a way that they hadn't before. There, of course, during COVID, a lot of homeschoolers said, hey, parents whose kids are at home right now, this isn't actually homeschooling. Homeschooling, when you're doing it full time, this isn't what it looks like. And I would agree with that. Being sent home stuff to school your kids, having them have to do these Zoom calls with teachers and class, that's really doesn't encompass what homeschooling is about. So,
well, and I think the challenge, or the challenges are still there in the culture and in education, right? We continue to see parents at school board meetings because they're not happy with things that are being taught, maybe in a public setting. And of course, some opt for private schools, and some aren't happy with even what's going on in some private schools. You still maybe have a culture there. In fact, I was just talking to a friend of ours, I think it was last week, about some of the culture that's developed in their school, their Christian school, with just some of the students, and with social media and the influence of that, and just the way the kids treat each other. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things, whether it's some issue like all the gender chaos that's being pushed, whether it's some of the social pressures, whether it's the bullying or whatever it might be. There's many of us parents out there who have been asking the question, should I homeschool my child? And even if you aren't maybe thinking that's an option, you're still thinking, like you said, Erin, you're still rethinking education. This is a good thing. Okay, so, but what we want to do, we want to answer this question, should I homeschool my child? Which I think is a question that even if you're already homeschooling, I think this episode is going to be helpful just to maybe remind ourselves of some things. And kind of what we want to do is answer questions that are being asked and that should be asked when you consider this. And in part of this, I mean, some of this can get really practical. Some of this will be thinking philosophically and biblically about education, right? And that's what we need to think about as parents. Like, what is the best model, or how can we most effectively educate our kids? And of course, we talk about this a lot on the podcast, but education, what is, answering the question, what is education, through the Christian worldview. And so we have mentioned Deuteronomy chapter 6 a number of times, which I want to actually go back to just as a reminder to all of us as parents, no matter whether you are homeschooling your kids or whether you've got them in public school or private school, the primary educator of the kids, however you do it, if you outsource it a little bit, but we as parents are the primary educators. We have the primary responsibility, and we need to bear that weight upon us. And this is in Scripture. I think the same idea is communicated, but Deuteronomy 6, chapter 6, verse 7 talks about teaching our kids diligently, right? You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. I think this communicates this idea, right? Teach our kids diligently, but it's in all of life. And so even in our view of education, it's not confined to the classroom. The classroom is one of those places, and we can be very intentional in a classroom setting, but it should spill over. Education should spill over all throughout our lives. And I mean, what's the context here? Well, the context is Deuteronomy 6:4, right? The great commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, ... right? And so the context is the great commandment, and the idea that there's one true and living God, and we are to love him. And of course, Jesus expands on this in Matthew 22, the great commandment, love the Lord your God. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, right? And there's the larger view of education. So parents are the primary responsibility, or have the primary responsibility. And the larger view in the Christian worldview of education is love of God, love of man, and the idea of flourishing, and the idea that education is the formation of the entire person, body, soul, right? Heart, mind, emotions, will, all of it. It's the whole person. And so just a reminder that that's the larger biblical view. And so that's where we have to start. And if you haven't listened to our podcast on education, what's the title of that one, Erin? Remind me.
Oh, I don't know. You always write the titles, but we could link to it in our show notes.
That is exactly what we'll do. We will link to that podcast, but we talk about really developing a Christian view of education. Mm-hmm. So I want to encourage you to listen to that, because that really is then going to help us answer the question individually, as parents, as individual families, should I homeschool my child?
Yeah, and part of our story, if you haven't listened to that podcast or other podcasts, maybe where we've mentioned it, but we do have 5 children. 3 are adults now, but we did not start out homeschooling. We have done actually all 3 kinds of schooling. We've done public school with our kids. We've done private school, and we've done homeschooling. Now we've landed in homeschooling and then stayed here for a long time now. I think this is year 15 for for us doing this. So I think we've been homeschooling now 15 years, but we do actually have experience in putting our kids in public school and private school as well. So part of our journey was starting to think about this, like you said, and wanting to come at it from a Christian worldview.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we start there, that's going to help guide our answer, whether or not we should. And so I thought the most helpful way to go about this is going to be, I'm just going to shoot 10 questions at you, Erin, actually, because you are definitely more of the expert on this than I am. I mean, we've been in this journey together, but you do bear a larger brunt of the workload in homeschooling our kids. And you've read widely on this. You've thought carefully on this. And plus, I want to put you on the hot seat. And so I'm gonna launch the questions at you, and I'll weigh in when I have something wise to say. But I'm gonna let you really take over this podcast. So we're gonna go through top 10 questions on homeschooling. And some of this is gonna get real practical. Okay, so number 1, Erin, are you ready? Or are you prepared?
I don't know. Audience, he doesn't prepare me well for things, so be gracious.
I always am. I'm very gracious.
No, I was talking to the audience.
Oh. They always are. We have a very gracious audience. We don't get a ton of hate mail, actually. Thank you for that, friends.
Not a ton, yeah.
Okay. Number 1. Okay, first tell us, Erin, what is homeschooling? What is homeschooling? And the idea behind this is for like those who might just be thinking about it, considering it for the very first time. You grow up with a model, and this was you and me. We grew up being publicly educated, and so you just think, I replicate school out there in the public schools or in the private schools. I replicate that same thing in my house, maybe at the kitchen table. So what is homeschooling?
Oh my gosh. That's such a big question. There's a lot of things that come to my mind, but the idea of taking what they do in school and just doing it at your kitchen table, I would ask, if someone said that, that's what I'm thinking I would do, I would say, well, why would you want to do that? Because
would you ask that with a little bit of an attitude?
No.
Why would you want be nice to do that? Okay.
So I would want to get them to think about why are they considering homeschooling and not putting their kids in public or private school? Is there something about that they think isn't working, or is it fear? So I would want to unpack that a little bit. And then I would say, well, no, you don't have to model things after most likely the way you were sent to school or whatever. It's not as if this system that we have has in America currently has been the system for humanity throughout time.
Yeah, actually, this system is fairly recent.
Yeah, fairly new. It's about depending on where you would put the beginning marker at, but basically you could say our system is about 150 years old. And so, give or take, as they say. So, considering that humanity has been around for a while, it's not as if this is the way it's always been done. And so you don't have to feel compelled to just copy what is being done currently. The nice thing about homeschooling is you can start to think outside the box. And actually, I do think it's beneficial to think, oh yeah, for thousands and thousands of years, kids have been educated in different ways with different models of education. And so what seems to be good for kids, and starting to ask these types of questions is better, I think, of a starting point. And then, asking what is homeschool? Well, I would say hopefully homeschooling means that you are starting to think broadly about the issue of education, that it isn't just the time where the math book is pulled out, but actually education is life, and that is a philosophy of Charlotte Mason, who I've mentioned before, who's had a huge influence on our family in developing our philosophy of education. But really it's a reflection of what Deuteronomy says, that parents are the primary educators because parents are the ones that children do life with.
Yeah.
And so in that way, the parents are the master teachers of their children.
Yeah. So one thing to consider if you are going to homeschool or you're just thinking about it is that you have the freedom to make paradigm shifts here. And in fact, maybe shattering some of the paradigms that we've simply assumed or absorbed from the culture is a good thing. But there's a lot of freedom to think outside the box. And if you think it is simply, I take what's done between 8 and 2 at my local public or private school, and then I just replicate in that in the house, that's going to be pretty overwhelming. Yeah. And that may discourage you from doing it. And we want to say that's not what homeschool is, that we want to actually think a little more broadly about this. And there is a freedom that comes with thinking of education is just kind of life, right? All of life I'm to be growing and learning and exploring and creating and all of those things. So I think that question really is to kind of get people I think a lot of people just envision, okay, I replicate that in the home, and it's all these worksheets and all this curriculum and all these quizzes and all these tests. And this is where I think it's good for us to constantly evaluate what we're doing, because we should ask the question, is it most effective to have kids, generally speaking, sitting behind a desk from 8 to 2 in a classroom setting? Is that the most effective way to learn and to teach them? So,
and just to piggyback on that, you mentioned Matthew 22 and Jesus talking about loving God with all of our heart, soul, mind, strength, and then loving our neighbor as ourselves, and that these are the greatest commandments. And Charlotte Mason broke down education in like 3 different areas, but the first one was knowledge of God, and then knowledge of man, which includes a lot in there, and then knowledge of the world or nature, meaning
or creation.
And she kind of had these categories, which I think are helpful in having a biblical view of kind of what we're supposed to teach our kids.
Yeah.
And having these categories have been helpful for me to go back to, because kids learning how to work and kids learning how to get along with siblings is a part of their education, because it taps into their knowledge of man. What are we here for? What's good about man? What's bad about man? What's broken? What are we to do with each other? How are we to treat each other? This is all a part of it. And so having these categories, I think, are much more helpful than first grade, second grade, third grade state goals or state testing. The knowledge of God, knowledge of man, knowledge of nature are these big, robust categories that maybe that sounds overwhelming. In some ways it is, but it's big and huge, and we have so much to learn, and that's exciting and never boring.
Yeah.
There's an endless world of learning when you look at it that way. And so just making a shift like that sometimes can be the shift that you need to make right at the beginning when you're asking the question, should we homeschool?
I think you just gave us 3 good categories. I guess Charlotte Mason gave us those through you.
Yes, all credit
her ghost
to her.
speaks today. But if you're a parent, wherever your kid is being educated at this point, those are 3 categories to evaluate their education. Okay, what are they learning about God? What are they learning? Are they learning about human nature? And what are they learning? Right? What are they learning about man? Which, I mean, just pause there for a second and think about that. I mean, that's a big challenge right there. What are we being taught? And if gender madness is, and I don't say that, what do you call it? I don't think that's not hyperbole. Mm-hmm. It really is some insanity that we're facing in the culture. But there's a view of man that's being taught explicitly to our kids. So we need to evaluate that. And then our view of the natural world, reality around us, what's being taught. And if you are not happy with what's being taught at those three levels, I mean, that's a great tool to evaluate. Then you definitely have got to rethink the methods of education. Yeah. Okay, second question, Erin. What are the benefits that you've seen from homeschooling? And you don't have to go through all of them. Maybe what are some of the top, 2 or 3 benefits? What are the pros that you've seen of homeschooling the kids?
Yeah, it is hard to narrow down because there's a reason we've done it for 15 years now. It's because we've seen so many benefits that we've stayed at it. So I think, though, I would say top 2 are benefits of homeschooling is first and foremost just the amount of time that we've gotten to be with our kids, especially having the perspective now of 3 adult children. We do realize when they're toddlers and 5-year-olds, and you just think time seems to go so slow. Sometimes days just seem to drag on. And you just can't imagine them not being at home, but they do grow up and leave. And so I'm so thankful for the time that we got to be together. For one thing, we've talked about on the podcast becoming experts of your kids, and having the time with them helps you to study them and know them deeply. And there's benefit from that. And also they know you that way too. But just the closeness that we've had as a family and the time with the kids is one of, I think, the top benefits. The second benefit I would say to homeschooling that I have seen is the individualized, which I mean this in the good way, the individual time and focus that each child can have, or that you can have with your children. And it goes into your knowledge of them, of knowing them well, but just that they can study, learn, and grow at their own pace.
Yeah.
And in a culture that's so crazy and there are all these expectations on kids, that if your child is 5 and they're not reading yet, that's okay in homeschooling because that's where they're at. And where they're at is okay. And they need to grow and that they're going to grow in these things, but it's okay. And it's funny how when they're little kids and their teeth, some kids get teeth early, some kids get teeth late, some kids grow at different stages of life. We're all fine with physical things happening at different times, but it seems like when it comes, especially to the academic things, that if your child isn't doing something at the same time as everyone else in their class, then they're behind, something is wrong. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are
these
problems,
artificial there's like these artificial standards.
And there's just not a lot of wiggle room for kids on when they need to master things. Homeschooling allows that wiggle room, and it allows that space for them not to feel dumb because they're not here yet.
Yeah.
It's just, oh, it's no problem. You're just not there yet.
Yeah. Or if they excel, the flip side is they excel, you can continue to, they aren't being held back by the entire group.
Yes.
And then get bored and
disoriented. And that's the individual part that I was talking about. If they're very gifted in math, you can just keep going and moving ahead. And then maybe they're struggling in other things, which of course, that's all of us, right? We all have areas that we're better at. So the individual of really being able to move at their speed with them has been a huge benefit that we've seen.
Yeah. So I these are huge benefits I love. And I would add that in addition, the socialization, which I run, and we'll talk more about that question, but I love this what has happened with the socialization of our kids. And then I also love that our kids love to learn, right? There's this, because what I've seen, and we've seen it with our own kids, is how often the modern system of education can sap our kids of their love of learning. So by the time they're in middle school and high school, reading is just a chore. That's a bad sign. If reading is a chore that you just have to get done, or you hate to read, or that kind of thing, man, then that's time to rethink things.
Yeah, whole posture towards learning and growing, it becomes kind of negative, and leisure and time off, and that's all the plus.
Yeah.
And any kind of pushing, growing, learning is kind of put in the category of a chore. And yeah, for sure. There's a lot of things we could say, but
yeah. Okay. Question number 3, how many hours a day should I homeschool? And maybe a quick view of like what a typical day looks like.
Well, this is going to look different depending on your philosophy of education. If you are a homeschooler, or maybe you just started homeschooling, or maybe during COVID you looked into it and dabbled in it. In the world of homeschooling, there's all different ways to do it. And so depending on how you do it, depends on how many hours a day you quote unquote homeschool. And so if you have a philosophy like we do, that education is a life, then homeschooling is part of every single day, even on Sunday, because you're going to church and you're learning there. And so you, as best you can, you remove these categories of our homeschool time is just when we're sitting down doing a worksheet or something. And it's really all of our life and all of our days. And so it includes going outside on a bike ride, and it includes family time, reading the Bible and prayers. And it includes chore time in the afternoon. Yeah. So how many hours do you homeschool? Well, if you're talking, though, just specifically about maybe the concentrated time you're reading, doing math, and those sorts of things, it depends on the age. And again, that paradigm shift, you don't take what they do in a kindergarten class and replicate that exactly at home. First of all, you don't have to do that because you don't have 30 kindergartners. You have 1 or maybe 2 if you have twins. And so you don't have all the classroom management and all the things that go along with that. So academically, what they do in a school day, you can do at home probably in an hour or so. And so, again, depending on what you're doing. And I definitely push more towards education of resting and joy and good things, and not a lot of worksheets. So my philosophy of education is going to come through in all of my answers. But I do think it should not be a day spent with pencil in hand doing worksheets at the kitchen table all day.
And I think I would add lots of reading, right? Lots of reading. And so it doesn't have to be, a lot of times, especially when they're younger, it's you or me reading to the kids, but then ultimately it's them reading themselves and really developing that love for books. So a very literature-based approach. And the idea I think behind this question is, like, again, just paradigm shattering a little bit here. You're not, having to do 8 hours at the kitchen table. That's unsustainable for any mom or dad. And the other aspect is, hey, when you're cooking, when you're working on the car, when you're gardening, these are opportunities for homeschool with your kids. They're learning about God's world. Okay, number 4, do you have to have some kind of teaching degree or a certification to homeschool your kids?
You don't have to, and in all the states, that's still, as far as I understand, the law. And so in America, you can still homeschool your kids without a teaching degree, thankfully. Again, the teaching degree and what you're trained to do as a teacher at a college has a lot to do with managing a classroom and teaching a classroom of 40 kids this certain subject or whatever. And so this is different. Charlotte Mason's idea of what a teacher is, again, this comes back to what I think a biblical view of a parent is, but she calls the teacher, she says a teacher is a philosopher, a friend, and a guide. And so thinking about a teacher that way, thinking about our job as parents that way is not that we have to write all these textbooks or have all these degrees to know how to teach, but sometimes it's just knowing how to find things for our children, like books and like going out in nature or these sorts of things. So no, you
some
don't.
parents who today might hear like, oh, philosopher? No, thank you. I don't want anything to do with that. And so what the idea there is that I guess you're a thinker, right? You don't have to have all the answers, but you're thinking along with your kids.
Yeah, and you're learning along with them, and you're helping to find answers. To things.
And if you say, "Well, I don't want to be a thinker," well, then okay, you need help. There's no help for you. Okay, so that's so no degree. The certification, the best certification is to be their parent. Number 5, how much does it cost to homeschool? I mean, are there big costs involved in this, or?
Well, again, it depends how you do it, but you can spend a fortune on homeschooling. There's catalogs and all kinds of curriculums. You can spend a lot of money.
All kinds of programs.
Yeah. We've never done that. As a family, we've relied on the library a lot. We've relied on borrowing things from other people a lot. And so, no, you can homeschool cheaply, and we can give some resources maybe where we've gotten ideas on how to do this. But no, you do not have to be wealthy and have a lot of extra income. I've always stayed home with the kids, so we've always had to live on one income. So we've had to be creative, but we've always had plenty of resources to use. And so, yeah, there's lots of ideas of how to do it very cheaply.
I love what Carol Joy Side says. You can homeschool with a Bible and a library card, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. Number 6, are there legal concerns? And, who do I report to? Do I have to get my home accredited or something like that? Like my, private school or?
Yeah. So every state is different. So whenever people ask us legal questions, I always send them to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. So Google that, HSLDA, and they have information on every single state, what you have to do to homeschool legally in your state. And I do encourage everyone I know that homeschools, if you start homeschooling or you have been homeschooling, that you get their yearly membership, because legally, if you're a member there, they will defend you if you ever did get into any legal trouble, or if your state for some reason came after you, or for any reason, they would defend you. And they're just an amazing resource. You can get on there for all kinds of resources. And so they're a great resource, and I always send people there for legal questions.
Okay. And so that's going to differ a little bit state to state. So you got to do a little bit of homework and find out. But okay, question number 7. What about like standardized tests? So, okay, when, the kids were in public or private school, they had days of testing. Are we required in homeschooling to do that kind of testing? And what about that? And then about, maybe thinking through performance a little bit on that. What if they aren't up to speed in their performance?
So testing will depend state to state, and HSLDA will help with that as far as what you're required to do. But I want you to think about testing and standardized testing in particular, and just to step back and think about, because this is something that we've gotten a lot of questions about over the years, and how do you prepare for that, and what do you do about that? And isn't that kind of the standard? Is that how you know if your kid's quote unquote behind in things? And so standardized testing is different from state to state often. There is like national standardized testing, but so between countries and countries, it's different. So think about what that means. It means that different people have decided that kids should know different things at different stages. So I think even in that, it shows that just because a standardized test in your state or your county or wherever you live has decided these are the things all fourth graders should know, it doesn't mean it's from God.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that your kid's behind or ahead or whatever, depending on how they do on the test. So I would have an open hand to all of that and realize, yeah, sometimes we have to jump through hoops, legal hoops for whatever we're doing. If you're in a charter school, a lot of times charter schools, you have to do state testing. I just wouldn't put a huge weight on that as far as evaluating how you're doing as a homeschool parent. I think there's other ways to gauge how we're doing, and I don't think standardized testing is the best one.
Yeah, and I think the weight of those results for us has been minimized. Like it's not significant. I mean, in one sense, I'd say I don't really care how the kids do on standardized testing. And part of that goes to two other questions: who and why, right? Who's putting these standards together, which is what you've talked about. But I want to mention, like, if you were to able to track down who has put these together, the question then you should ask is, okay, what's their worldview, right? Do we have a common worldview where this view of education and the particular standards is playing out because of those worldview commitments? And another question is why? Okay, so if this is the standard, why is that the standard? If my kid is supposed to learn this at fourth grade and that's what they're supposed to do, why? Why? We need to ask healthily skeptical, right? There's a healthy skepticism on these kind of things.
Yeah.
Okay. Question number 8. Should I use, and I'm gonna clarify, I'm gonna make a distinction before I give you the question, but should I use a formal curriculum? Because in one sense, we're all using a curriculum, right? You read the Bible, you're using a curriculum. You use God's world, that's a curriculum, and so to speak. But a formal curriculum. Okay, if I'm gonna homeschool, do I have to use a Becca, or do I have to use, any number of all, and this is where it can be overwhelming for parents, 1,000 different curriculums out there, classical conversations.
Yeah. You go to homeschool conventions and things, and you can walk into these rooms and just be overwhelmed.
The exhibit hall. You go to the exhibit hall and you will be overwhelmed.
Yes. So should you use curriculum? Well, I think the answer to that is that you first, before you pick a curriculum, you first need to think about your philosophy of education, meaning what you think about this topic of education and how children learn best, and then what curriculum or books or programs or whatever can help you in that task. And so just picking a random curriculum or just going off of, oh, my neighbor uses this math, so I'll just use it too. That's fine maybe at first. And sometimes I've tried things other people have recommended and it's worked out great. So I'm not dismissing that, but all these curriculums have views on kids, how they learn, what they should be learning. And so I think being secure in what yours is first is helpful.
Yeah.
And knowing what it is you're trying to do with the kids, and then you won't feel so overwhelmed on when it comes to choosing curriculums, because there are programs and things and all kinds of stuff that's geared towards a certain mindset about education. Yeah. And so figuring that out first will be helpful in the day-to-day sitting down doing things, because when you sit down with curriculums or things that aren't in the way you think education is supposed to be done, I'll just give the example of if you sit down with a curriculum that gives lots and lots of worksheets and you have a 5-year-old boy that you're trying to homeschool, I can almost guarantee you that's going to blow up in flames
It's going to
and
end
frustration.
badly.
Because I think there's a misunderstanding of 5-year-olds in general.
In the nature of human beings as
And
well.
the nature of people. So that's what I mean by there's ideas behind things. And so that's why we have to know what we think before we kind of choose. And that's why hopefully you could find an older mom or 2 or 3 or several or a group that has your similar philosophy, and then they can help you find things that would aid you in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have the freedom to actually take bits and pieces. And, and we kind of have done that. And it's very eclectic in that way. But if you think about it, here's something to think about when you feel the pressure of this whole question is, kind of modern day curriculums with textbooks and worksheets. Is that the vast majority? I mean, is that what we've been doing for the vast majority of human history? Have we had curriculum like that? No. So that is definitely not a requirement to homeschool. All right, number 9, the big question. What about the socialization of my kids? Or in other words, will my kids turn out weird? Right? And socially awkward.
This is a question we've gotten a lot. And can I share this?
Is that
story?
because they've looked at our kids in particular? Like, oh, how
They're
do I
like,
prevent
what
that?
about their socialization, for heaven's sake? No, well, one time, okay, I've been asked this question many times, like, aren't you worried about them? And so now that our kids are older and we've been doing it for a long time, we don't get that quite so much. But in the beginning, for sure, we got it. And one time there was a news reporter from our local newspaper that was going around our neighborhood asking about this local thing happening. And it was about 12:30, and 2 of our kids were outside
12:30
scootering in the
during the day,
afternoon.
okay.
Yeah. And they were outside scootering. So I was sitting in the front and I could see her. She kind of walked up and was like, hi, and asking, why aren't you guys at school? And they said, oh, we homeschool. And she was like, oh. And so I could hear the little conversation. And then I came out on the front porch and said hi. And then she says to me right away, she said, they said you homeschool. And I said, yeah. She goes, oh, so are you worried about their socialization? And I said to her, well, I'm not really worried. I mean, did they seem awkward to you? And she said, no, actually, they were so friendly. And actually, I noticed she said, they looked me in the eye when I was talking to them. And a lot of kids don't do that. And so it was funny that she had this experience with our kids and yet still asked this question. But we've talked about this before.
There's almost a programming in the
Yes.
culture. You're programmed to ask this, and you're programmed to think this about homeschooled kids.
Yeah, that in other words, behind that is like, aren't you worried they're going to be weird because they never get to spend time with kids?
Yeah.
And so there's lots to unpack there, and you could go a lot of ways when people ask you this question. But what about socialization is something that we could ask about all of kids and all of adults. How are you socialized?
Whether they're in public school, private
Yeah.
school, or homeschooled. That question should be asked of every kid.
Yeah. And so we don't worry about socialization because we actually think it's beneficial for kids to spend time with people of all different ages, all different kinds of people. And homeschooling allows for the freedom for them to not be stuck in a classroom with kids who are the exact same age on the calendar as them,
Yeah.
but they're oftentimes playing with kids who are different ages, and they get used to that. So actually, the socialization that we've seen from homeschooling has been far better than we could have even hoped for, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's better for them to be socialized more so by mature adults right? And so think about, I mean, is it better? And again, we're not ruling out public or private school or the classroom or whatever. These are things to think about because we thought about them as well. But if you're comparing the socialization of one kid with 30 of their peers who are often more selfish, less virtuous, less mature, and being socialized primarily by their parents who love them and more invested in them than anyone else. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
Like, gosh, being socialized by, a bunch of my narcissistic peers often. I mean, let's be honest, right? And this is why I think a lot of parents, they start thinking about homeschooling like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, middle school, because they start seeing things that emerge in their kids that they're not happy about. Things like attitude, right? Or maybe things that they're saying, or even how mean they can become. I just talked to a mom last night who said she's seen some homeschool kids who got put in a public school. And this is, again, don't feel defensive out there if your kids are in public school. Just think about these things though, because you're going to have to, if these are realities, you're going to have to help mitigate that if your kids are in public school. But she's seen the kind of the transformation of these kids who were friends to her kids, but gone into the public system now. And she said they've just become meaner. And to the degree where she doesn't want her kids interacting with those kids now, because she doesn't want those kids who have been socialized in this setting to then socialize her kids. So,
I think this socialization question gets put on homeschoolers only.
Yeah.
And not on all parents.
That's right.
When they're thinking about their kids. And it's not fair. I get it that, are there quote unquote awkward, weird kids that homeschool? Well, sure. But
Yes.
you're not suggesting there aren't any in public school, are you? Because that's
Exactly.
that's ridiculous. I mean, both you and I went through public school. We all know that there are kids that are awkward or whatever you want to say in all school settings. And sadly, though, in the school settings, typically those kids who are awkward or just socially not aware of things or whatever, typically those kids are harassed and brutalized in a school setting. And so it would make sense if your child did struggle with that you would consider homeschooling, because you would want to properly protect them from that. And I actually think that's a proper protection if you know that about your kids. So
you're not worried about it?
I'm not worried about our kids.
And parents out there shouldn't be worried about it. We've actually seen some huge benefits in terms of their socialization.
Yeah.
Okay, question number 10, last question. Can I change my mind once I start? Or am I locked in for the rest of eternity?
If you decide to homeschool in kindergarten, you're committed all the way through high school.
Okay, people are out. No, thanks. In fact, let's be honest. Let's be honest, Erin. When we started homeschooling Micah, when he was in 1st grade, you said to me specifically, you looked me in the eye with tears streaming down and a clenched fist. You said, I will give this 1 month. And if after 1 month it doesn't work out, we're putting him back in public school. Agree? And I agreed. And you made me sign in blood on that agreement. But you literally, seriously, you said 1 month, we're going to give this a try. And if not, we'll put him back in school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if COVID showed us nothing else, it showed us that making long-term decisions and thinking you have it all figured out is not reality. No, I think you can change your mind on all kinds of things, and you probably should be open-handed in, we will try this, even in homeschooling. We'll try this curriculum. We'll try this co-op. We'll try this book club. We'll try this nature group. And know that you actually, this is one of the joys that homeschooling brings, is that it opens up all kinds of opportunities, and you aren't stuck the way you kind of feel stuck when, like I said, we've done all the schooling. So when your kid gets the third grade teacher that's mean and not the nice third grade teacher, you're kind of stuck for the year. You're stuck. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot you can do.
Yeah.
And this changes all of that. You have freedom to make the best decision for your family. And so, no, you're not stuck, and don't think you have to decide forever today. You can decide, like I did, this month we're going to try it, or this year we'll try it for half the year and see how it goes, or we'll try this school year and then see how it goes. And if it brings about good, then maybe then you say, okay, next year we'll try it again. I oftentimes in the summer still, I evaluate, okay, what did we do last year? Was it good? Should we do this co-op again, or this group again, or should I do this same math curriculum again? And did we have enough time outside? Did we spend enough time reading books? And I evaluate every summer how the year's gone. So you have a lot of freedom in homeschooling, which is part of the joy of it too.
Yeah. Okay. To end this, just give us one resource. I see you've got a stack of resources. You're like Mrs. Resource. Like you want to throw out 30 books, which is just too overwhelming to our audience. But for someone who's considering, what's just one book? Where would you just say, start with this?
Well, then I would have to say For the Children's Sake.
Ding, ding, ding. That's the right answer.
Susan.
That's what I was.
By Susan Schaefer Macaulay. And it's called For the Children's Sake, Foundations of Education for Home and School. So this is Susan Schaefer Macaulay's story of finding a school for her girls. They lived in England. And she discovers this lady, Charlotte Mason, that I talk about. And so she kind of unpacks Charlotte Mason's view on education. And then Susan Schaefer Macaulay found schools near her where her girls went to that did the Charlotte Mason style. So oftentimes people think I recommend it because it's a homeschooling book, but it's actually an education book. Yeah.
In fact, I was going to say, it does not matter if your kids are homeschooled, public schooled, or private schooled. Every parent should read this book. And I want to urge parents, get this book and read this book For the Children's Sake, because it will help you start thinking carefully through a philosophy of education, a biblical view of education. And that is the starting point, which we kind of constantly hammer on.
Yeah. And there is an Audible of it, so you could listen to it as you're driving to and from work or whatever. But I do recommend it for all parents, all educators. It's a really, really good book.
Yeah, so hopefully this has been helpful in answering the question, should I homeschool my child, by answering other questions that you've got to answer before you can answer that. And
if they want more resources, can they email me and ask, and I'll send
email
them?
You personally? You don't want to put out your email.
Well, they can email us at Maven, and I'll send them the rest of the titles of the books.
Just so you know, that might mean you have 20 extra emails.
I like to send out book ideas.
Why don't we do this? You put together a little list of your best resources, and then people can email us. So if you're listening to the podcast, email Maven at info@maventruth.com. And then you're going to put pressure on Erin, and you're going to ask for Erin's list of educational resources. We're not even going to be just homeschool resources, but they're going to be educational resources. And then we will just send you a document with all of your resources. Okay, you got a lot of work ahead of you, Erin.
Happy reading, everyone.
Maven exists to help the next generation know truth, pursue goodness, and create beauty for the cause of Christ. To find out more, check out maventruth.com.